Sometimes the deepest wounds never heal, they just teach us how to carry the pain. For 9 long years, aging cowboy Silas Boone rode through the dusty New Mexico territory with an ache in his chest that no amount of whiskey could ever numb. The night the bandits came, they took everything, his wife, his ranch, and Buck, the loyal cattle dog who had been his constant companion. Now, as Silas prepares to hang up his spurs for good, fate has one more surprising hand to play. Walking down a dusty border town street, he sees a familiar face, older, scarred, but unmistakably his beloved Buck. But where has Buck been all these years, and what secret has he been protecting? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of San Miguel as Silas Boone adjusted his weight in the saddle, favoring his left leg. The old wound from a bull's kick 3 summers back still ached when the weather turned, and today promised to be another scorcher in the high desert of New Mexico territory. At 62, Silas carried his years in the deep lines etched around, his grey eyes and the silver stubble that perpetually covered his weathered jaw. His hands, gnarled from decades of rope work and hard labor, rested easy on the reins, despite the arthritis that made his fingers stiff each morning. The town of San Miguel sprawled before him like a tired old dog in the shade, dusty, worn, but still breathing. Adobe buildings lined the main thoroughfare, their flat roofs catching the early light, while wooden boardwalks creaked under the weight of merchants setting up for another day of commerce. The smell of fresh tortillas drifted from a cantina where an old woman tended her camal, mixing with the earthy scent of horses and leather from the livery stable. Silas had been riding since before dawn, leading his small herd of cattle, the last remnants of what had once been a prosperous ranch. 23 head of prime beef, their brands still crisp and clear despite the years. They represented the final chapter of a life that had once held such promise, such simple joy. In his vest pocket, wrapped carefully in a piece of soft cloth, lay Martha's wedding ring, a simple gold band that had cost him 2 months' wages back in 1868. He'd carried it every day since that terrible night 9 years ago, a talisman of love that death couldn't diminish. The memories came easier now than they had in the early years after the tragedy. Time had a way of smoothing the sharp edges of grief, though it never truly dulled the ache. He could picture Martha as clearly as if she stood before him, her dark hair always escaping the pins she used to tame it, her hands flour-dusted from morning baking, her laugh that could chase away the darkest storms that rolled across the high plains. She'd been 26 when they married, he 28, both of them full of dreams about the life they'd build together on the 160 acres they'd claimed near the Pecos River. Those had been good years, the best of his life. Their ranch had prospered through hard work and careful planning. Martha had a gift with the vegetable garden and the chickens, while Silas proved skilled at reading cattle and horses. But it was Buck who had made their small operation truly successful. The blue heeler had appeared at their door one spring morning in 1878, barely more than a pup, but already showing the intelligence and drive that would make him legendary among the local ranchers. Buck had been Martha's idea. Silas remembered coming in from checking fence lines to find her sitting on their front porch, the spotted puppy asleep in her lap. He was just wandering around the barn, she'd said, scratching behind the dog's ears. Looked hungry and lost. Figured he could earn his keep if he's got any herding sense. The dog had more than herding sense. He'd had an almost supernatural ability to read cattle, to anticipate their movements and guide them with an economy of motion that amazed even the most experienced cowboys. Buck could work a herd of 50 head with the skill of 3 men, never wearing himself out, never losing his temper with stubborn steers. More than that, he'd become the heart of their little family, as devoted to Martha as he was to Silas, sleeping on a rug beside their bed and following Martha around the ranch like a furry shadow. Now, 9 years later, Silas still caught himself looking for that blue-grey shape moving through the herd, still listened for the soft whistle Buck would give when he'd spotted a stray. The silence where Buck's presence should have been had become as much a part of Silas's daily routine as checking his horse's shoes or counting cattle. Some losses never stop echoing. The ranch had died with Martha, not immediately. Silas had tried for 2 years to keep it running, to honor the life they'd built together. But without her steady presence, without Buck's help, and with his own, heartbroken beyond repair, the place had slowly fallen apart. Fences went unmended, cattle wandered off, and the vegetable garden returned to prairie grass. Finally, he'd sold the land to a young family from Kansas and kept only what cattle he could manage alone. For the past 7 years, he'd lived a nomadic life, moving from ranch to ranch as a hired hand, never staying long enough to form attachments. His reputation as an honest worker who knew cattle preceded him, so he never lacked for employment. But the loneliness had worn him down, settling into his bones like the arthritis in his hands. At his age, with winter coming on, and his body reminding him daily of its limitations, it was time to find a rocking chair and a warm hearth somewhere. San Miguel represented his last stop. He'd heard the town had a good cattle buyer, and the money from this final sale would give him enough to rent a small room somewhere and live quietly until the good Lord called him home. It wasn't much of a retirement plan, but it suited a man who'd already buried his dreams alongside his wife. The town was stirring to life as he guided his cattle toward the holding pens near the railroad siding. A few early risers nodded politely. As he passed, San Miguel was still small enough that strangers were noticed, but not necessarily unwelcome. The sheriff, a compact Mexican man with graying temples, stepped out of his office and touched his hat brim in greeting. Silas returned the gesture, appreciating the courtesy. "Senor, you bring cattle to sell?" the sheriff asked in accented but clear English. "Yes, sir, Sheriff. Martinez, you have papers for them?" Silas reached into his saddlebag and produced the bills of sale, each one meticulously maintained despite his wandering lifestyle. Sheriff Martinez examined them with the thoroughness of a man who dealt with his share of cattle rustlers, then handed them back with a satisfied nod. "Everything appears in order. Senor Hutchins at the cattle yard will treat you fairly. He is an honest man." "Much obliged, Sheriff." The cattle yard occupied a full acre behind the railroad depot, with sturdy corrals and loading chutes that spoke of steady business. Silas found Hutchins, a lean man with intelligent eyes and calloused hands, examining a herd of longhorns that had obviously traveled far. They dickered over price with the ritual politeness that all cattle transactions demanded. And within an hour, Silas had a fair sum of money in his vest pocket alongside Martha's ring. As he led his horse away from the pens, Silas felt the peculiar emptiness that always followed the completion of a long task. For months, these cattle had been his responsibility, his purpose. Now they were someone else's concern, and he was just another aging cowboy with no place particular to go. The feeling should have been familiar by now, but it still caught him by surprise. The sun had climbed higher, bringing with it the promise of serious heat. Silas decided to find some shade and consider his options. There had to be a boarding house or hotel in a town this size, somewhere he could rest while he figured out his next move. Maybe he'd head east to Colorado, where the mountains might ease his aching joints. Or perhaps south to El Paso, where an old friend from his army days had mentioned starting a freight business. As he walked his horse down the main street, taking in the rhythm of a town going about its daily business, Silas allowed himself a moment of something that might have been peace. The worst was behind him. The grief, the struggling, the long years of wandering. Whatever came next couldn't be harder than what he'd already survived. It was then, as he paused in front of the general store to let a wagon pass, that he saw the dog. It was just a glimpse at first, a flash of blue-gray fur moving between the buildings across the street. Something about the way it moved, the particular set of its shoulders, and the alert carriage of its head, made Silas's breath catch in his throat. He'd seen 1,000 dogs over the years, and more than a few had reminded him of Buck. His mind had played tricks on him before, conjuring familiar shapes from shadows and wishful thinking. But this was different. This dog moved with a purpose and intelligence that struck him like a physical blow. Before he could think better of it, Silas was crossing the street, his limp forgotten in his haste. The dog had disappeared between two buildings, but he could hear the soft padding of paws on hard earth. When he rounded the corner into the narrow alley, his heart nearly stopped. There, not 20 feet away, stood a dog that looked exactly like Buck. Older, scarred, with grey touching his muzzle and a wariness in his eyes that hadn't been there 9 years ago. But unmistakably, impossibly, Buck. Time seemed to suspend itself in that narrow alley between the general store and the barber shop. Silas stood frozen, his weathered hand still gripping his horse's reins, staring at the impossible sight before him. The dog, Buck, his mind insisted despite every rational objection, returned his gaze with equal intensity. Those eyes, dark brown with flecks of amber, held the same intelligence Silas remembered, but there was something new there too, a wariness, a calculation that spoke of hard years and harder choices. Buck, the name escaped his lips as barely, more than a whisper, carrying 9 years of grief and desperate hope. The dog's ears pricked forward at the sound, his head tilting in that achingly familiar way. For a heartbeat, recognition flickered across the animal's features. But then he stepped back, not in fear, but in careful assessment, as if weighing Silas against some internal measure of threat. The years had marked Buck as surely as they had marked Silas. Scars traced silver lines through his blue-grey coat, one across his left shoulder that suggested a knife wound, another on his right flank that could only have come from a mountain cat's claws. His frame had filled out with muscle and maturity, but there was a leanness to him that spoke of irregular meals and constant vigilance. This was not the well-fed ranch dog of Silas's memory, but a survivor who had learned to depend on his wits and strength. Silas took a careful step forward, his hand extended palm up in the universal gesture of peace. "Easy, boy. Easy now. It's Silas." Buck's response was immediate and heartbreaking. His tail began a tentative wag, his body language shifting from wariness to confused joy. He took 2 steps towards Silas, then stopped abruptly, as if remembering some important duty. A soft whine escaped him, a sound of such conflicted emotion that it nearly brought tears to the old cowboy's eyes. "I know, boy. I know it's been a long time." Silas's voice broke slightly. "I looked for you. God knows I looked everywhere." It was then that he noticed the collar. Not the hand-tooled leather collar with brass studs that he'd made for Buck years ago, but a makeshift affair of rope and cloth that had seen better days. Something about it nagged at his memory, and as Buck shifted position, Silas caught sight of what the dog was protecting. Behind Buck, pressed against the adobe wall of the alley, stood a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, with long dark hair tied back in a practical braid, and clothes that marked her as someone who worked for her living. Her brown eyes held the same wariness as Buck's, and she kept one hand resting on the dog's back in a gesture that spoke of long partnership. "It's all right, Buck," she said softly, her voice carrying the faint accent of Spanish mixed with English. "He's not one of them." The girl studied Silas with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading danger in strangers' faces. There was something about her expression, a maturity beyond her years, that reminded him of children who had grown up too fast in hard country. But there was also a strength there, a quiet confidence that impressed him despite the circumstances. "You know this dog?" she asked, her tone neither hostile nor welcoming. Silas struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a grief-stricken old man. "He looks exactly like a dog I lost 9 years ago. Same marking, same build. Even moves the same way." The girl's expression didn't change, but Silas caught a flicker of something. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Buck continued to divide his attention between his old master and his new companion, his distress obvious. "What was his name?" she asked quietly. "Buck. His name was Buck." At the sound of his name spoken by Silas, the dog took another step forward, his tail wagging more enthusiastically, but again he stopped, looking back at the girl as if seeking permission. "Go on," she said gently. "Go say hello." Buck needed no further encouragement. He bounded forward with the exuberance of a much younger dog, pressing against Silas's legs and looking up at him with undisguised joy. Silas dropped to one knee, ignoring the protest from his bad leg, and buried his hands in the familiar coat. Buck's scent was different, wilder, touched with sage and desert wind. But underneath it all was the same warm smell of loyalty and love that Silas remembered. "Where have you been, boy?" he whispered into Buck's fur. "Where have you been all this time?" When he looked up, tears blurring his vision, the girl was watching with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was sadness there, but also something that might have been relief. "He came to me when I needed him most," she said simply. "Just like he came to you, I'm guessing." Silas straightened slowly, Buck still pressed against his legs. "What's your name, miss?" "Elena Rodriguez." She paused, studying his face. "And you are?" "Silas Boone. I had a ranch northeast of here, up along the Pecos. Buck lived there with me and my wife." He swallowed hard. "Until the night the bandits came." Elena's face went very still at the mention of bandits. "When was this?" 9 years ago, this October. They burned us out, killed my Martha." His voice caught on his wife's name. "Buck disappeared that same night. I figured they'd shot him, or he'd died in the fire." "October of 1880, Elena said, and there was something in her voice that made Silas look at her more carefully. "That's right. October 15th, to be exact." "Why?" Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she knelt down beside Buck, who moved to position himself between her and Silas, not aggressively, but protectively. Her hands found something around the dog's neck, hidden beneath the makeshift collar. With careful fingers, she worked at the knots until she could lift away the rope and cloth. Underneath was a collar that made Silas's heart lurch. Hand-tooled leather with brass studs, exactly as he remembered making it in his workshop behind the ranch house. The leather was cracked and worn now, stained dark with years of weather and wear, but unmistakably his work. "He's never let me take this off," Elena said quietly, holding up the old collar. "Not once in all the years he's been with me. I always wondered who made it, who he was remembering when he'd sit and stare at the horizon for hours." Silas reached out with trembling fingers to touch the collar. His thumb found the small mark he'd carved into the brass nameplate, a tiny star that Martha had insisted on. "For good luck," she'd said, laughing as she watched him work. "He saved my life," Eleanor continued, replacing the rope collar around Buck's neck with gentle hands. "I was 7 years old, alone in the desert after—" She stopped, her jaw tightening. "After my family was killed. Buck found me 3 days later, half dead from thirst and sun-sickness. He led me to water, brought me rabbits to eat, kept me warm at night." The pieces were beginning to fall into place in Silas's mind, forming a picture so tragic and incredible that he could barely comprehend it. "Your family's ranch, when were they killed?" "October 1880, the same night you lost your wife, I'm thinking." They stared at each other across the dusty alley, two survivors of the same terrible night, connected by the dog who had somehow lived through it all. Buck seemed to sense the weight of the moment, pressing himself against both of them, as if trying to bridge the gap between past and present. "He protected you all these years," Silas said, wonder in his voice. "He taught me to survive, to hunt, to hide, to read the signs that danger was coming." Elena's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "Without him I would have died in the desert, and now he's torn between us." Silas looked down at Buck, whose brown eyes reflected the confusion of divided loyalty. "He remembers his old life, but he won't abandon his new one." Eleanor nodded. "He's a good dog." The best I've ever known." She paused, then added quietly, "But I always knew this day might come. I always knew someone somewhere was missing him as much as I would if he left." The implications hung in the air between them. Here was Buck, alive and well, but bound by 9 years of loyalty to a girl who needed him as much as Silas had ever needed anything. The joy of finding his old companion was tempered by the realization that Buck belonged to someone else now, someone who had earned his devotion through shared hardship and mutual dependence. "Where do you live?" Silas asked. "Here and there. We move around a lot." Elena's vagueness suggested there was more to the story, but she wasn't ready to share it. "In town? Sometimes. When there's work." She straightened, and Silas caught a glimpse of the determined woman she was becoming. "We take care of ourselves, Buck and me. We don't need charity." The pride in her voice reminded him of Martha, who had never wanted to be seen as helpless or dependent. It was a good quality, but dangerous in someone so young and alone. "I didn't mean to suggest you did." Silas chose his words carefully. "But a man gets curious about what happened to the best dog he ever knew, and about the young lady who's been taking such good care of him." Elena studied him for a long moment, seeming to weigh risks and possibilities. Finally, she nodded toward the mouth of the alley. "We should go. People will start to wonder what we're doing back here." As they emerged onto the main street, Buck walking between them like a bridge between two worlds, Silas felt the weight of questions pressing against his chest. 9 years of wondering where Buck had gone, what had happened to him, whether he'd suffered or found peace. And now new questions, darker ones about Elena and how a child had survived alone in country that killed grown men. The collar hidden beneath Buck's makeshift rope harness seemed to burn with significance, a tangible link to the past, proof that some things endure even when everything else is lost to fire and violence. But it also raised the question that neither he nor Elena had yet voiced. What happened now? The rest of that first day passed in a haze of careful observation and growing questions. Elena had disappeared as quietly as she'd appeared, taking Buck with her, despite the dog's obvious reluctance to leave Silas behind. The old cowboy had watched them go with a mixture of understanding and heartache, recognizing that Buck's loyalty now belonged to someone who needed it more than he did. But understanding didn't diminish the burning need to know more. Silas began his inquiries carefully, the way a man learned to gather information in country where the wrong question could mark you as either a fool or a threat. His first stop was the cantina where he'd smelled fresh tortillas that morning, reasoning that the woman who ran it would likely know the comings and goings of everyone in town. The proprietress was indeed a fountain of local knowledge. Maria Santos had been feeding travelers and locals for nearly 20 years, and her establishment served as an unofficial gathering place for news and gossip. She was a compact woman, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing, working her Gamal with the efficiency of long practice. The girl Elena. Maria wiped her hands on her apron and studied Silas with frank curiosity. "See, I know her. She comes sometimes for work, cleaning, carrying, whatever needs doing. Muy trabajadora, very hard-working. Never asks for charity, that one. Been here long?" Silas kept his tone casual as he ordered coffee and beans. 8 years, maybe 9. Showed up one day with that dog, both of them half wild and skinny as fence posts. Maria shook her head at the memory. Just a little thing then, couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but she had eyes like an old woman. You know what I mean? Like she'd seen too much. Silas nodded, thinking of the wariness he'd observed in Eleanor's face. Any family? None that I ever heard tell of. Asked around when she first came, thinking someone must be looking for a lost child, but nobody knew nothing about her. Maria ladled beans onto a plate with practiced efficiency. Sheriff Martinez. He tried to get her to talk about where she came from, but she'd clam up tight. Finally, he just let it be. What else could he do? Send her to an orphanage 300 miles away. The coffee was strong and bitter. Exactly what Silas needed to sharpen his focus. What about the dog? He seems well trained. Aye, that dog. Maria's face lit up with genuine admiration. Smartest animal I ever seen. Watches over that girl like she was made of gold. And he works. Helps her move things, carries messages, even helps corral loose chickens when they get out. People pay extra just to have him help with their chores. From the cantina, Silas made his way to the livery stable, where he found old Pete brushing down a travel-worn mare. Pete was one of those ageless men who might have been 50 or 70, with hands that spoke of a lifetime working with horses and a manner that suggested he'd seen enough of human nature to judge it fairly. Elena and that blue dog of hers. Pete spat tobacco juice into the straw and continued his brushing. Yeah, I know 'em. Girl's got a way with horses, I'll give her that. Comes by sometimes when I need help with a difficult animal. Dog's useful too. Keeps the stable cats from fighting and watches for horse thieves. Horse thieves? We get 'em through here regular. Too close to the border for comfort and not enough law to go around. Pete's weathered face creased with concern. That girl's smart to stay mobile, if you ask me. Dangerous country for someone alone. The more Silas learned, the more his admiration for Elena grew, and the more his worry deepened. An orphan child surviving in lawless country took more than just intelligence and a good dog. It took luck, and luck had a way of running out. His. Next stop was the sheriff's office, where he found Martinez updating wanted posters on a board outside the door. The sheriff greeted him with the same polite professionalism he'd shown that morning, but Silas caught the subtle assessment in his eyes. You ask many questions about Elena Rodriguez, senor, Martinez observed without looking up from his work. This is curious for a man just passing through. Silas chose directness over deception. That dog she travels with, he used to be mine. Lost him 9 years ago when bandits hit my ranch. Martinez paused in his work, his attention fully focused. Now, 9 years ago? What ranch? Up on the Pecos, northeast of here. The rocking bee spread. Silas met the sheriff's steady gaze. Same night, they hit the Rodriguez place, from what I can gather. Ah, understanding flickered in Martinez's dark eyes. Diego Vargas raiders. See, I remember hearing about those attacks. Muy malo. Very bad business. He set down his hammer and studied Silas more carefully. You lost family. My wife, Marta. And I thought I'd lost Buck, the dog too. But now you find them both alive, the dog and a girl from another ranch that was hit the same night. Martinez nodded slowly. This explains much about Elena's nightmares. Nightmares. When she first came to town, she would wake up screaming. Dr. Hernandez, he said it was common in children who had seen violence. The dog, he would calm her down, sleep beside her until the fear passed. Martinez's expression softened. They saved each other, I think. The picture forming in Silas's mind was both heartbreaking and inspiring. A traumatized child and an injured dog, finding each other in the wilderness and forging a bond strong enough to survive years of hardship. No wonder Buck's loyalty was divided. Elena had earned it through shared suffering and mutual dependence. As the afternoon wore on, Silas continued his subtle investigation. At the general store, he learned that Elena traded odd jobs for supplies and never asked for credit. The blacksmith praised her skill at holding horses while he worked on their shoes. The doctor confirmed that she'd brought Buck to him once, when the dog had been injured by a rattlesnake, paying for the treatment with 2 weeks of work cleaning his office. Every story painted the same picture. A resourceful, independent young woman who asked for nothing but earned respect through hard work and honesty. And always, the dog was mentioned, not as a pet, but as a partner, equally committed to their shared survival. It was near evening when Silas finally spotted them again. Elena was helping an elderly woman carry groceries to her adobe house on the outskirts of town. Buck trotting alongside with a basket balanced expertly on his back. The sight of his old dog performing such a mundane task with such obvious pride brought an unexpected smile to Silas's face. He watched from a distance as Eleanor carefully arranged the woman's purchases inside her house, refusing any offer of payment. Beyond a handful of tortillas wrapped in cloth, Buck waited patiently by the door, alert to every sound and movement in the gathering dusk. When they emerged, Elena spotted Silas immediately. For a moment, he thought she might avoid him again, but instead she approached with Buck at her side. In the fading light, he could see she was carrying something, a small, obviously handmade doll crafted from scraps of fabric and stuffed with what looked like prairie grass. The little figure was worn smooth by handling, its embroidered features faded but still visible. "You've been asking questions about us," she said without preamble. "I have," Silas admitted. "Folks speak highly of you both." Elena's expression remained neutral, but Buck moved closer to Silas, tail wagging tentatively. The dog's divided loyalties were becoming more obvious, and Silas could see it was causing Elena distress. "What do you want, Senor Boone?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. What did he want? To reclaim his dog? To understand how a child had survived what would have killed most adults? To somehow make amends for 9 years of not knowing Buck was alive and protecting someone? Who needed him? "I want to understand," he said finally. "I want to know how you both survived, and I want to help if you'll let me." Elena studied his face in the dim light, the doll clutched against her chest like a talisman. Buck looked between them, sensing the weight of the conversation. "We don't need help," she said, but there was less conviction in her voice than before. "Maybe not," Silas agreed, "but that doesn't mean you couldn't use some. This is hard country for anyone alone, especially someone your age. I'm not alone. I have Buck, I know, and he's lucky to have you." Silas chose his next words carefully. "But I've been asking around, and I've learned some things. This area's getting more dangerous, not less. More bandits, more drifters, more men who wouldn't think twice about hurting a young woman traveling alone." Elena's grip tightened on the doll, and Buck pressed closer to her leg, sensing her distress. For the first time since Silas had met her, she looked like what she was, a teenager carrying burdens too heavy for her shoulders. "Where we go and what we do isn't your concern," she said. But the words lacked the heat he'd expected. "Maybe not. But Buck was my family once, and anyone who's family to him becomes family to me." Silas met her eyes steadily. "I'm not trying to take him away from you, Elena. I can see how much you both mean to each other. But I'd like to know more about where you've been and where you're going." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently stroking the doll's worn fabric. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow. If you really want to know, meet us by the old church at sunset. But understand, once you know the whole truth, you might wish you'd just ridden on." With that, she turned and walked away, Buck following with one last, longing look at his former master. Silas watched them disappear into the gathering darkness, wondering what secrets a girl and a dog could carry that would be worth such a warning. The old church sat on a rise at the eastern edge of San Miguel, its adobe walls crumbling and its bell tower empty of both bell and purpose. Weeds grew through cracks in the stone steps, and wooden shutters hung askew over windows that had long since lost their glass. It was the kind of place that spoke of better times and broken dreams, a fitting location for secrets to be shared. Silas arrived early, partly from anticipation and partly from the old soldier's habit of scouting any meeting place before the appointed time. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, and the air carried the first hint of evening coolness. From his position on the church steps, he could see most of the town spread out below, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures that seemed to cling to existence through sheer stubbornness. When Elena appeared, she came from the opposite direction than he'd expected, materializing from behind the church with Buck at her side. It occurred to Silas that she'd probably been watching him for some time, making sure he'd come alone and posed no threat. The caution spoke of hard-earned wisdom that no 16-year-old should possess. "You came," she said simply, settling onto the steps beside him, with Buck lying down between them. "Said I would." Elena reached into her small traveling pack and withdrew several items. A piece of jerky that she shared with Buck, a small water gourd, and something wrapped carefully in faded cloth. She offered the jerky to Silas, who accepted it gratefully, recognizing the gesture as a sign of trust. "Where do you live?" Silas asked quietly, not wanting to break the fragile peace between them. Elena pointed toward a cluster of ruins about a quarter-mile from the church. "There's an old adobe out there. Used to be a homestead before the family moved on. Most of the roof's gone, but one room's still sound. Buck and I fixed it up some. Mind if I see it?" She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Come on." The walk to Elena's home revealed more about her survival skills than any amount of questioning could have. She moved across the uneven ground with the silent grace of someone who'd learned to travel without leaving traces. And Buck ranged ahead, in a pattern that clearly served as an early warning system for potential threats. The ruins were more extensive than they'd appeared from a distance. What had once been a modest ranch house now stood as a collection of crumbling walls and scattered timbers, slowly returning to the desert that had briefly been tamed. But Elena had chosen her refuge well. The remaining intact room was positioned to provide good views in all directions, while remaining hidden from casual observation. Inside, Silas found himself impressed by the ingenuity and care that had gone into making the space livable. A small fire ring had been constructed with stones, positioned to vent smoke through a gap in the roof where it would disperse quickly. Bedrolls were arranged on a platform of salvaged boards that kept them dry and away from desert creatures. Supplies were stored in wooden crates arranged along the walls, everything organized with military precision, but it was the personal touches that caught his attention. A small shelf held Elena's few precious possessions. The handmade doll he'd seen her carrying, a leather-bound book with water-stained pages, and a piece of charred wood about the size of his fist. The wood was obviously old, blackened by fire but carefully preserved, and Elena noticed his interest immediately. "That's from my family's house," she said, settling onto her bedroll with Buck curling up beside her. "From the main beam over the kitchen door. My papa carved our name into it when we first moved there." She unwrapped the cloth bundle she'd brought and revealed the charred wood, holding it with the reverence reserved for religious relics. In the fading light, Silas could just make out the letters Rodriguez burned into the surface, the carving barely visible beneath the fire damage. "I went back once, about 3 years ago," Eleanor continued, her voice steady but distant. "There wasn't much left, just foundations and burned timbers scattered by the wind. But I found this piece and knew I had to keep it. It's all I have left of them." The weight of that simple statement settled over Silas like a heavy blanket. He thought of Martha's ring in his vest pocket, his own tangible connection to love lost, and understood the importance of physical reminders when memory alone wasn't enough to bear the load of grief. "How old were you when it happened?" he asked. Gently. 7. Old enough to remember everything, but too young to do anything about it. Eleanor set the charred wood carefully on the shelf between the doll and the book. "They came at night, just like they did to your place. Papa tried to fight them off, but there were too many. Mama hid me in the root cellar under the kitchen, told me not to come out no matter what I heard." Buck shifted closer to Elena, pressing against her leg in a gesture of comfort that spoke of countless nights when these memories had surfaced in dreams. Silas found himself leaning forward, drawn into a story he wasn't sure he wanted to hear, but knew he needed to understand. "I stayed down there until morning, listening to the shouting and shooting, smelling the smoke. When I finally came out, the house was gone, and so was everyone." Elena's voice remained matter-of-fact, as if she was recounting someone else's tragedy. "I wandered around for 3 days, calling for my parents, my little brother Miguel. Found their bodies eventually, but by then I knew they couldn't hear me." The casual way she spoke of such horror made it somehow more terrible than if she'd wept or raged. This was pain that had been carried so long it had worn smooth, like a stone polished by years of handling. "That's when Buck found you?" 4th. A day. I was sitting by what used to be our well, dying of thirst and too tired to care anymore. He just appeared out of the desert like some kind of miracle." Elena's hand found Buck's head, scratching behind his ears in the unconscious gesture. Of long habit, he was hurt bad. Cuts on his legs, burns on his back, limping something fierce, but he led me to water first. Then to rabbits he'd caught. Wouldn't let me give up. Silas imagined Buck in those first days after the attack, wounded and searching for his lost family, finding instead a traumatized child who needed him even more than Silas had. The dog's choice to stay with Elena suddenly seemed not like abandonment, but like the highest form of loyalty, recognizing where he was needed most and making the sacrifice to serve. He taught me how to hunt, how to read sign, how to hide when dangerous men came through. Elena's voice carried quiet pride. Some dogs just know things, you know. Buck always seemed to understand what I needed to learn to stay alive. Where did you go? How did you survive out here? We moved around a lot the first few years. Buck seemed to know where water was, where game would be, which places were safe to rest. We'd find abandoned homesteads like this one, stay until we had to move on. Sometimes we'd work for ranchers during roundup season. Buck was worth 3 cowboys when it came to moving cattle, and I was small enough to crawl into places grown men couldn't reach. Elena reached for her water gourd and took a careful sip before continuing. Started coming through San Miguel about 3 years ago. People here are decent mostly, and Sheriff Martinez keeps the worst element moving through instead of settling in. Figured it was as good a place as any to try staying put for a while. But you don't stay in town. Too many people, too many questions. And Buck gets nervous when he can't see what's coming from all directions. Eleanor gestured around their makeshift home. Out here we can see trouble coming and be gone before it arrives. In town you can get trapped. The wisdom in her words impressed Silas, even as it saddened him. This was knowledge no child should need to possess, survival skills learned through necessity rather than choice. Yet Elena had not only survived, but managed to maintain her essential humanity, helping others in town despite having every reason to trust no one. "Elena," Silas said carefully, "the men who attacked your family and mine, do you know what happened to them?" Something flickered in Elena's eyes, there and gone so quickly he almost missed it. Buck's ears pricked forward, sensing the change in her emotional state. "Why do you ask?" "Because men like that don't usually just disappear. They find other ranches, other families." Silas kept his voice gentle. "I've wondered for 9 years if they were still out there, still hurting people." Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out through the doorway at the desert that had shaped her into someone far older than her years. When she finally spoke, her words carried a weight that made the evening air seem suddenly colder. "They're still out there, Senor Boone, still hurting people, still taking what isn't theirs and leaving death behind." She turned to look at him directly, and in her eyes he saw not the traumatized child she'd been, but the determined young woman she'd become. "I know because I've been watching them. And Buck knows, because he's been helping me plan what we're going to do about it." The implications of her words hit Silas like a physical blow. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, or perhaps revenge. And suddenly he understood why Elena had warned him that knowing the truth might make him wish he'd ridden on. The silence that followed Elena's revelation stretched between them like a taut rope, heavy with implications that Silas was only beginning to understand. Buck seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, his dark eyes moving between Elena and Silas as if measuring the old cowboy's reaction to this dangerous truth. "Elena," Silas said carefully, "what exactly do you mean when you say you've been watching?" "Them." Elena rose from her bedroll and moved to one of the storage crates against the far wall. After a moment of careful rummaging, she withdrew a rolled paper that looked official and ominous. When she unrolled it in the fading light, Silas recognized it immediately as a wanted poster, though this one was far more detailed than most he'd seen. The face staring back at him from the weathered paper was burned into his memory, despite the 9 years that had passed. Diego Varga. The name printed below the sketched portrait meant nothing to him then, but the scar running from the man's left temple to his jaw was unmistakable. This was the face Silas had seen in the firelight that terrible night, laughing as Martha's screams echoed through their burning home. "Where did you get this?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Sheriff Martinez had it posted outside his office about 6 months ago. I borrowed it." Elena's matter-of-fact tone didn't hide the risk she'd taken. "I'd been hearing stories about raids that sounded familiar, the same methods, the same cruelty. When I saw his face again, I knew." Silas studied the poster more carefully. The reward was substantial. $500, a fortune that would keep Elena comfortable for years. But what caught his attention were the details listed below. The sketch, known associates, preferred targets, and most disturbing of all, a pattern of recent activities that painted a picture of escalating violence. "He's gotten worse," Elena continued, settling back down beside Buck. "In the old days, he was content to steal cattle and horses, burn out homesteaders who got in his way. But according to the stories I've heard, he started taking people too. Young women mostly, selling them to slavers across the border. The blood in Silas's veins turned to ice water. Martha had been young and beautiful. If she'd survived the fire, would Varga have simply taken her to be sold like livestock? The thought was almost too terrible to contemplate, yet it explained the particular viciousness of that night's attack. "How do you know all this?" I listen. "People talk around children and young women like they're invisible, especially if those children don't seem to be paying attention." Elena's smile held no warmth. "I've spent 3 years listening to conversations. In cantinas, around campfires, in sheriff's offices. Varga's men brag about their work when they think no one important is listening. And Buck remembers too. Dogs don't forget a scent, especially one connected to trauma." Elena's hand rested on Buck's back, and Silas could see the tension in both of them. "Sometimes he'll catch a familiar smell on the wind and get restless, aggressive. That's how I first knew Varga was still operating in this area." Silas looked at his old companion with new understanding. The scars he'd noticed weren't just from surviving in the wild, they were from confronting evil and living to tell about it. Buck had been preparing for war all these years, just as Elena had been. "Elena, you can't seriously be planning to go after him. He's got a crew of hardened killers and you're—" "I'm what? A little girl who should leave justice to the men?" There was steel in Elena's voice now, the hard edge of someone who'd seen too much and endured too long. "I've been preparing for this longer than you can imagine. I know his patterns, his habits, his weaknesses. And I'm not the helpless child who hid in a root cellar anymore." To prove her point, Elena reached into another crate and withdrew items that made Silas's eyebrows rise. A Winchester rifle, well-maintained and obviously functional. A Colt revolver that looked like it had seen use. A knife with a bone handle worn smooth by careful hands. And most surprising of all, a collection of maps marked with notations in Elena's careful handwriting. "I know where he camps when he's in the area. I know which trails he uses and when. I know he has a weakness for pulque and tends to drink too much on Saturday nights." Elena spread one of the maps across her lap, pointing to various marked locations. "I've been tracking his movements for 2 years, waiting for the right opportunity." Silas studied the maps with growing amazement and concern. Elena's intelligence gathering was thorough and professional, the work of someone who understood that information was the most valuable weapon in any conflict. Red marks indicated confirmed sightings of Varga or his men. Blue marks showed probable campsites. Black marks, and there were several of these, indicated sites of recent attacks. "This is dangerous work, Elena. If he'd caught you watching him, he'd have killed me, yes. But he didn't catch me, because I learned from the best teacher possible." She scratched Buck's ears affectionately. "Buck taught me to move without being seen, to watch without being noticed. And he taught me to trust my instincts about danger." The devotion between the girl and the dog was obvious, But Silas was beginning to understand it went deeper than simple companionship. They were partners in a mission that had consumed years of their lives, bound together by shared trauma and a common enemy. "Show me," Silas said quietly. Elena looked surprised. "Show you what?" "Everything. I want to see all of it. Your maps, your intelligence, your plans. If you're serious about this, if you've really been preparing for years, then I want to understand what you're up against." For the first time since he'd met her, Elena looked uncertain. "Why?" "Because Buck was my family once, and that makes you family too. Because Martha deserves justice just as much as your parents do. And because a 16-year-old girl shouldn't have to face a killer like Varga alone, no matter how well prepared she thinks she is." Elena stared at him for a long moment, clearly weighing risks and possibilities. Buck looked between them, his tail beginning a tentative wag, as if sensing that the pack was about to grow larger. "If I show you everything," Elena said finally, "there's no going back. Once you know what I know, what I'm planning to do, you'll be part of it whether you want to be or not." "I understand." "Do you? Because this isn't about glory or adventure. It's about facing the man who destroyed both our families and making sure he can never hurt anyone else. It's dangerous, probably deadly, and definitely illegal in the eyes of most law." Silas thought of Martha's ring in his vest pocket, of 9 years of carrying grief like a stone in his chest, of the empty years that stretched ahead if he rode away and left this unfinished. He thought of Buck, torn between loyalty to his old life and duty to his new one, and of Elena, carrying burdens that would have broken most adults. "Show me," he said again. Elena nodded slowly, then began to lay out additional maps and documents. As the last light faded from the sky and Buck settled more comfortably between them, she began to reveal the full scope of her investigation. What she showed him was both impressive and terrifying. The methodical preparation of someone who understood that revenge, to be successful, required patience, planning, and precision. "Varga has a base camp about 20 miles south of here," Elena began, pointing to a spot on the map marked with multiple notations. "It's in a box canyon with only one way in or out, surrounded by his men and protected by lookouts posted on the rim. He thinks it's impregnable, but you've found a weakness. Several, actually. The water supply comes from a spring at the back of the canyon. The lookouts change shifts at dawn and dusk, leaving brief windows of opportunity. And most importantly, Varga has gotten overconfident. He thinks everyone who could threaten him is either dead or too afraid to try." Elena's finger traced routes on the map, showing approach paths and escape routes, all marked with the careful detail of someone who'd scouted them personally. Silas found himself reluctantly impressed by her thoroughness, even as his concern for her safety grew. "When?" he asked. "Soon. He's planning something big, I can tell from the increased activity, the way his men have been gathering supplies and weapons. If I wait much longer, he might move on or change his patterns." Elena's voice carried the weight of decision. "I was thinking next week, but now that you're here..." "Now that I'm here, we do this right," Silas interrupted. "No rushing, no unnecessary risks. If we're going to face Diego Varga, we need to be smart about it." Elena's eyes widened slightly at his use of "we," but she didn't object. Instead, she smiled, the first truly warm expression he'd seen from her. "Buck was right about you," she said quietly. "You are good people." As if in response to his name, Buck lifted his head and looked at both of them with what could only be described as satisfaction. For the first time in 9 years, his pack was complete. Over the next 3 days, Silas found himself drawn into Elena's world in ways he hadn't expected. What had begun as curiosity about his lost dog had become something approaching partnership, though Elena remained cautious about fully trusting anyone beyond Buck. Each evening, after she finished her work in town, they would meet at the ruined adobe to share meals and plan their approach to Diego Varga. The girl's intelligence continued to amaze him. She had developed not just survival skills, but a sophisticated understanding of tactics and strategy that would have impressed any military commander. Her maps were annotated with wind patterns, seasonal water flows, and the movement habits of local wildlife, all information that could mean the difference between success and death in a desert confrontation. But it was during their quieter moments that Silas began to truly understand the depth of Elena's strength and the weight of her burden. On the third evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, she began to share details of her family's life that revealed just how much Varga had taken from her. "My papa was a dreamer," she said absently, braiding buck's fur between her fingers. "He came north from Sonora with nothing but hope and a determination to build something better for his children. Mama used to tease him about his grand plans, the cattle empire he was going to create, the house he was going to build when the ranch started paying off." Eleanor's voice carried a wistfulness that made her seem even younger than her years. "They were good people. Papa never cheated anyone, never turned away someone who needed help. Mama taught school for the Mexican children in the area, even though there was no money in it. They believed that if you worked hard and treated people right, life would reward you. Sounds like they raised a daughter who carries on those beliefs." Silas observed, "Sometimes I wonder if they'd be proud of what I've become, or if they'd be horrified that their little girl learned to track killers and plan vengeance." Eleanor's uncertainty was rare enough to be precious, a glimpse of the normal. "Young woman, she might have been under different circumstances." "They'd be proud," Silas said with conviction. "Any parent would be proud of a daughter who survived what you survived and still cares enough about justice to risk her life for it." Elena considered this, then reached into her pack and withdrew, something that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful, hanging from a delicate chain that had obviously been repaired multiple times. "I found this at our ranch when I went back 3 years ago," she said, holding the locket up to catch the last rays of sunlight. "It was buried in what used to be Mama's garden, probably dropped during the attack." She opened the locket with careful fingers, revealing a tiny photograph inside. Even in the fading light, Silas could see it showed a young couple on their wedding day. Elena's parents, frozen in a moment of joy and hope that had been destroyed by violence and greed. But it was what Elena did next that truly shocked him. She carefully removed the photograph and showed him the other side of the locket. There, somehow preserved through fire and weather, was another tiny photograph. This one showed Silas and Martha on their own wedding day, younger and happier than he'd felt in years. "How?" Silas began, then stopped, unable to process what he was seeing. "I found it in the ruins of your ranch too," Eleanor said quietly. "I went there after I found my family's place, thinking maybe I could learn something about what happened that night. Your locket was in what must have been your bedroom, under some fallen timbers." Silas stared at the impossible sight of his wife's face smiling back at him from Elena's locket. The photographs were so small and the locket so delicate that it seemed like a miracle either had survived the destruction of that night. "Martha wore this locket every day," he whispered, reaching out to touch the tiny image with trembling fingers. "It was her mother's, passed down through 3 generations. I thought it was lost forever. I've been carrying both our families with me," Elena said, closing the locket gently. "Seemed like they belonged together, since they died together." The gesture was so simple and yet so profound that Silas found himself struggling with emotions he'd thought were long buried. This girl, this remarkable young woman who'd survived impossibly hard circumstances, had been carrying a piece of his beloved Martha for 3 years. She'd honored his wife's memory alongside her own family's, creating a kind of shrine to their shared loss. "Elena, He stopped, overwhelmed by gratitude and grief in equal measure. "You don't have to say anything," she said, understanding his struggle. "But now, you know why I couldn't just walk away when I learned Varga was still alive. He didn't just kill our families. He tried to erase them, to make it like they never existed. Keeping their memories alive is one way to defeat him. Buck seemed to sense the emotional weight of the moment, pressing closer to both of them as darkness settled over the desert. In the distance, coyotes began their nightly chorus, a wild sound that reminded them all of the dangers that surrounded their small circle of firelight. "There's something else you should know," Elena continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "About that night, about how Buck ended up with me instead of dying in the attack." Silas waited, sensing that whatever Elena was about to reveal would be difficult for her to share. "Buck didn't just find me in the desert by accident. He was looking for survivors, going from ranch to ranch in a pattern that covered all the places Varga's men had hit. I wasn't the first child he found." The implications hit Silas like a physical blow. "There were others, 2 other children, both younger than me. A boy named Carlos from the Mendoza ranch, and a little girl called Rosa, whose family I never learned about. Buck found them first, tried to keep them alive the same way he kept me alive." Elena's voice grew thick with emotion. "But they were too young, too hurt. They didn't make it through the first winter." Silas closed his eyes, imagining Buck's desperate efforts to save children traumatized by the same violence that had destroyed his own family. The dog's heroism was even greater than he'd realized, not just finding and protecting Elena, but trying to save every innocent victim of Varga's cruelty. "Buck buried them," Elena continued. "Found a place under some cottonwood trees near a creek, dug graves with his own paws, and stayed with them until they were properly laid to rest. I helped him put stones on their graves and say some words. It was the least we could do." The image of Buck performing this most human of rituals, honoring the dead children he couldn't save, brought tears to Silas's eyes. This was grief and love and duty all combined in a way that transcended the boundaries between human and animal. "That's when I knew Buck wasn't just my protector," Elena said. "He was carrying the weight of everyone who'd been lost that night, trying to honor them by keeping me alive. It's been the 3 of us all along, me, Buck, and the memory of everyone who couldn't be saved." They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about loss and survival and the bonds that form between those who endure tragedy together. The locket lay between them on Elena's bedroll, its tiny photograph serving as a tangible link to the people they'd loved and lost. "Tomorrow," Elena said finally, "we start the final preparations. I've been patient for 3 years, but I can feel that Varga's planning something big. If we wait much longer, he might slip away again, and who knows how many more families will suffer while we hesitate." Silas nodded, understanding that their time for planning and remembering was drawing to a close. Soon they would have to act, to risk everything on a gamble that justice could still be found in a world that seemed to reward cruelty and violence. "Elena," he said, "before we go any further, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we go after Varga, there's a good chance we won't all come back. Are you prepared for that?" Elena's answer came without hesitation. "I've been preparing for that possibility every day for 9 years. The question is, are you?" Silas looked at Buck, who was watching both of them with the steady gaze of a dog who'd already made his choice long ago. Then he looked at Elena, seeing in her young face the determination of someone who'd already sacrificed everything for the chance to right a terrible wrong. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." As if in response to his words, Buck rose and moved to position, himself between Elena and Silas, his head resting across both their feet. The message was clear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The 4th morning brought news that changed everything. Elena had gone into town early to work for Mrs. Chen at the cantina, leaving Silas and Buck to study maps and refine their approach to Varga's stronghold. When she returned just after midday, her face was pale with excitement and something that might have been fear. "He's here," she announced without preamble, setting down a basket of supplies with shaking hands. "Varga's in San Miguel right now." Silas felt his blood turn to ice. "What? How do you know?" Elena reached into her pocket and withdrew a silver peso, holding it up so the sunlight caught its surface. At first glance, it looked like any other coin, Mexican silver worn smooth by countless transactions. But as Silas looked closer, he could see a distinctive scratch across the eagle's wing, a mark that turned an ordinary peso into something far more significant. "Mrs. Chen paid me with this for helping her move supplies this morning," Elena explained, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Look at the mark. It's Varga's signature. He scratches every peso that passes through his hands as a way of marking his territory, showing his men where he's been and what he's claimed." Silas examined the coin more carefully, noting the deliberate nature of the scratch. It was too precise to be accidental, carved with the tip of a knife in a pattern that would be recognizable to anyone who knew what to look for. "You're certain this came from him? I've seen enough of these over the years to be sure, and Mrs. Chen told me she got it from a customer who paid for breakfast. A Mexican man with a scar on his face who was asking questions about strangers in town." Elena's meaning was unmistakable. He's looking for something or someone, and given the timing of your arrival, he's looking for survivors. Silas finished, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. After all these years, he's still hunting down witnesses to his crimes. Elena nodded grimly. It makes sense when you think about it. Men like Varga don't live long by leaving loose ends. If he's heard rumors about a girl and a dog who've been tracking his movements, he'd want to eliminate the threat before it became dangerous. The realization that they'd been discovered fundamentally changed their situation. What had been a carefully planned offensive operation was now a defensive struggle for survival. Varga wasn't just a target to be hunted. He was a predator who had turned his attention on them. "How long has he been in town?" Silas asked, checking his revolver instinctively. "Mrs. Chen said he came in just after dawn. That was 6 hours ago." Elena began gathering their essential supplies with practiced efficiency. "We need to assume he knows about this place, about our connection. The fact that you've been asking questions about me and Buck would have reached his ears by now." Buck, sensing the change in mood, moved to the doorway and stood alert, his ears pricked for any sound of approaching danger. The dog's instincts had kept Elena alive for 9 years, and Silas trusted them completely. "What about the townspeople? Are they in danger?" "Probably not directly. Varga's too smart to cause trouble in a town with a competent sheriff unless he has to. But if he thinks we're using them to gather information or hide from him—" Eleanor left the sentence unfinished, but Silas understood. Innocent people could die simply for showing them kindness. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses reached them across the desert air. Buck's posture stiffened, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, a warning that Silas had learned to take seriously over the past few days. "How many?" Elena whispered, moving to join Buck. At the doorway, 3 horses, maybe 4, coming slow and careful. Elena's voice carried the calm precision of someone accustomed to evaluating threats. "They're not trying to hide their approach, which means either they're confident or they want us to know they're coming." Silas joined them at the doorway, peering across the sun-baked landscape toward the dust cloud that marked their visitors' progress. The riders were still too far away to identify, but their careful approach suggested reconnaissance rather than attack. "Could be scouts," he observed. "Testing to see if we're here, how we're armed, whether we'll run or fight." Elena was already moving, gathering specific items from their supplies, with the efficiency of someone who'd planned for this contingency. She handed Silas his rifle and ammunition, keeping her own weapons close at hand. "There's a back way out." "Of here," she said, indicating a gap in the ruins that led toward a wash running behind the homestead. "Buck and I scouted escape routes when we first set up here. We can be gone before they arrive. Or we can stay and see what they want," Silas countered, Running might just confirm their suspicions and bring the whole gang down on us. Elena considered this, weighing options with the speed of someone whose life had depended on making correct decisions under pressure. If we stay, we're trapped. This place has good defensive positions, but only one real way out if things go bad. But if we run now, we lose everything. Our supplies, our planning, our advantage of knowing the terrain. Silas checked his rifle, ensuring it was ready for action. And we'd be running blind, not knowing how many more of them might be. Out there, the sound of horses grew closer, and Buck's growl intensified. Whatever decision they made needed to be made quickly. "There's something else," Elena said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't told you about Varga, about why he's so dangerous." Silas looked at her sharply, sensing that another revelation was coming. One that might change everything yet again. He doesn't just kill people for profit or revenge. He enjoys it, takes pleasure in causing pain, in watching people suffer before they die. Elena's words carried the weight of personal knowledge. "I saw what he did to my parents, how long he took with them. This isn't just about eliminating threats, it's about feeding something sick inside him." The implications were clear. If Varga had indeed tracked them down, this wouldn't be a quick execution or even a fight between enemies. It would be a prolonged exercise in cruelty, designed to satisfy the killer's twisted need for suffering. "All the more reason to make our stand here," Silas said grimly. "If we're going to face him anyway, better to do it on ground we've prepared than caught in the open desert." Elena nodded slowly, accepting the logic, even as her face showed the strain of facing the moment she'd been preparing for since she was 7 years old. "Buck, back position," she commanded quietly. The dog immediately moved to a spot near the rear wall that gave him a clear view of both the main entrance and the escape route. His positioning was so precise and automatic that Silas realized this wasn't the first time they'd prepared for a siege. "How often have you had to do this?" he asked. "Often enough. Men like Varga have long memories and patient grudges. This is the 4th time in 2 years that someone's come looking for us, specifically." Eleanor's matter-of-fact tone was chilling. "The difference is, this time it's Varga himself instead of just his men. The riders were close enough now that individual shapes could be distinguished. 3 horses, as Elena had predicted, with a 4th pack animal trailing behind. The lead rider sat his horse with the confident posture of someone accustomed to command, and even at a distance, Silas could see the distinctive scar that marked Diego Varga. "It's him," Elena breathed, and for the first time since he'd met her, Silas heard real fear in her voice. Varga's appearance was both exactly what Silas had expected and somehow worse than his nightmares had painted. The man was larger than he'd seemed in firelight 9 years ago, with the broad shoulders and thick arms of someone who took personal pleasure in violence. His scar was more prominent than in the wanted poster, cutting a silver line through sun-darkened skin that spoke of years spent in harsh country. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as dangerous. Even at a distance, Silas could see the cold calculation in Varga's gaze as he surveyed the ruins, noting defensive positions and potential escape routes with the expertise of a predator who'd survived by being more cunning than his prey. "He's not here to capture us," Silas realized with growing dread. "He's here to play with us first, then kill us slowly." Elena's grip tightened on her rifle. "I know. I've been preparing for this moment for 9 years. The question is, are you ready to face the man who killed your wife?" Silas thought of Martha's locket, now safely stored in Eleanor's pack, and of the 9 years he'd spent carrying grief like a stone in his chest. He thought of Buck, torn between old loyalty and new duty, and of Eleanor, who'd sacrificed her childhood. "To prepare for this moment, yes," he said quietly. "I'm ready." The riders had stopped about 200 yards away, close enough to demonstrate their presence, but far enough to avoid immediate danger. Varga raised his hand in a mockingly casual greeting, his scarred face split by a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Elena Rodriguez," he called, his voice carrying easily across the desert air. "I've been looking for you for a very long time. And Senor Boone, yes, I know who you are too. It seems the dead have returned to life, which makes this reunion even more interesting." The fact that he knew both their names confirmed Eleanor's worst fears. They weren't just being hunted. They were walking into a trap that had been years in the making. But there was no turning back now. The moment Elena had been preparing for since she was 7 years old had finally arrived, and whatever happened next would determine whether justice or cruelty would prevail in the end. Varga's voice echoed across the desert, carrying with it the promise of violence and the weight of old grudges finally coming due. Silas felt his hand instinctively move to the weapon he'd sworn never to use again, his father's Colt revolver, a relic from the war between the states that had remained, holstered through every conflict he'd faced since returning to civilian life. "What do you want, Varga?" Elena called back, her young voice steady despite the tremor Silas could see running through her hands. "What I've always wanted, Nina, to finish what I started 9 years ago. Though I must admit, I'm impressed you survived this long. Most children die screaming within the first week." Varga's laughter was like broken glass scraping against stone. "But then again, you had help, didn't you? A clever dog and an old man who should have stayed dead." The casual cruelty in his voice confirmed everything Elena had told Silas about. The bandit leader's nature. This wasn't just about eliminating witnesses, it was about savoring the fear and pain of his victims before ending their lives. "We know what you are," Silas called out, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice. "We know what you've done to other families, other children. This ends today." "Does it?" Varga's smile widened, showing teeth yellowed by tobacco, and stained with the evidence of too many years of hard living. "I count 3 of you against 6 of my men. Those aren't particularly good odds, even for a war hero." The mention of Silas's military service sent a chill down his spine. Varga had done his research, learning not just their names, but their histories. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a carefully planned execution, designed to settle old scores while satisfying the killer's twisted appetites. "Elena," Silas said quietly, not taking his eyes off the riders, "how much time do we have before dark? 3 hours? Maybe 4. Elena's tactical mind was already working, calculating angles and possibilities. Why? Because Varga's not going. To wait for nightfall to make his move. Men like him prefer to see their victims' faces when they kill them. Silas checked his rifle one more time, ensuring every cartridge was seated properly. He's going to try to end this before sunset. Buck had moved to a position between Elena and the doorway, his body tense with anticipation. The dog's battle. Instincts were fully engaged now, his eyes never leaving the mounted figures who represented everything he'd spent 9 years protecting Elena from. "There's something you both need to understand," Elena said, her voice taking on the hard edge of someone making final preparations. "I didn't spend 9 years just learning to survive. I learned to kill. When this starts, when the shooting begins, don't hesitate to protect yourselves because you think I'm too young or innocent to handle violence. That girl died the night my family burned." The matter-of-fact way she spoke of her own transformation was both impressive and heartbreaking. Silas found himself looking at Elena with new eyes, seeing not the traumatized child she'd been, but the hardened warrior she'd become. It was a necessary evolution, but one that came at a price no 16-year-old should have to pay. "What's your assessment of their positioning?" he asked, treating her as the tactical partner she'd proven herself to be. Elena moved to the window, studying the terrain between their position and Varga's men, with the practiced eye of someone who'd survived by reading landscapes and understanding advantage. "They're positioned to prevent us from reaching our horses, but they've left the back trail open. Either they don't know about it, or they have men positioned to catch us if we run. Which do you think? Varga's too smart to miss an obvious escape. He's got men back there, probably positioned in the rocks about half a mile out." Eleanor's analysis was clinical, professional. This whole thing is designed to give us the illusion of choice, while actually herding us exactly where he wants us. Silas felt a reluctant admiration for Varga's tactical thinking, even as he despised the man's methods and motives. The bandit leader had survived this long by being more than just brutal. He was intelligent, patient, and thorough in his planning. Then we don't play by his rules, Silas decided, reaching for the weapon he'd hoped never to draw again. His father's Colt was heavier than he remembered, its weight carrying with it memories of a different war and a younger man who'd believed that violence could solve problems rather than simply create new ones. The weapon had seen action at Shiloh and Antietam, had taken lives in service of causes that seemed distant and abstract now. Silas had sworn after Appomattox that he'd never again use violence as a tool for solving human problems. But some promises, he realized, were made to be broken when innocent lives hung in the balance. "Elena, I need you to listen to me carefully," he said, checking the cylinder of the old revolver. "Your parents, your brother, they wouldn't want you to throw your life away for revenge. Justice and vengeance aren't the same thing." "I know the difference," Elena replied, but there was something in her voice that suggested the distinction had become blurred over 9 years of planning and preparation. "Do you? Because once shooting starts, once blood begins to flow, it's easy to lose sight of what you're really fighting for." Silas looked directly at her, trying to communicate the importance of what he was saying. "I've been there, Elena. I've seen what happens when good people let anger turn them into something they never wanted to become." Buck whined softly, sensing the tension between his two humans. The dog's confusion was understandable. He'd spent years protecting Elena from exactly the kind of violence they were about to embrace. "Senor Boone, Elena Rodriguez," Varga called again, his voice carrying a note of impatience. "Surely you're not planning to make this difficult. I have other business to attend to before dark." The casual arrogance in his tone sparked something dangerous in Silas's chest, a cold anger that he'd thought was buried with Martha, but was apparently just dormant, waiting for the right provocation to bring it roaring back to life. "What do you propose?" Elena called back. "Simple. You walk out with your hands visible, leave your weapons behind, and I promise to make this quick. Fight me, and I'll take days to finish what I started with your family." Varga's smile never wavered. "The choice is yours, but choose quickly. My patience has limits." Elena looked at Silas, her brown eyes reflecting the weight of decisions that no young person should have to make. In that moment, he saw not the hardened survivor she'd become, but glimpses of the child she'd been. Smart, brave, but ultimately vulnerable in ways that 9 years of harsh living couldn't entirely erase. "There's a third option," Silas said, quietly, an idea forming in his mind. "We don't run, and we don't surrender. We take the fight to them on our terms." "How?" "Buck." Silas looked at the dog, who was watching their conversation with obvious intelligence. "You said he's been preparing for this as long as you have. Dogs like Buck don't just protect. They attack when their pack is threatened." Elena's eyes widened as she understood what he was suggesting. "You want to use Buck as a weapon? I want to use Buck as what he is, a member of our family who's as invested in stopping Varga as we are." Silas knelt down beside the dog, looking into those dark eyes that had seen too much violence and loss. "But only if he chooses to. This has to be his decision." As if in response to his words, Buck moved to the doorway and looked out at the mounted figures. A growl rumbled deep in his chest, and his hackles rose as he fixed his attention on Diego Varga. The dog's body language was unmistakable. He recognized the enemy, remembered the scent and sight of the man who destroyed their first family, and was ready to finish what had been started 9 years ago. "He remembers," Eleanor whispered, wonder and pain mixing in her voice. "All this time, he's been carrying the same anger we have." The realization brought with it a sense of completion, as if a circle that had been broken that terrible night was finally closing. They weren't just 3 separate individuals facing a common enemy. They were a family united by loss, and bound together by love, each committed to protecting the others regardless of the cost. "Time's up," Varga announced, his voice carrying, across the desert with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You've made your choice by refusing to make one. Miguel, Carlos, circle around to the back. Pablo, cover the horses. I'll take the direct approach." The sound of movement reached them as Varga's men began to implement their plan. The illusion of negotiation was over, replaced by the harsh reality of impending violence. In minutes, maybe seconds, bullets would start flying and lives would be lost. "Elena," Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of final instructions, "whatever happens, remember that your parents loved you. Don't let Varga's evil erase the goodness they put into this world." "And you remember Martha," Elena replied, understanding the gift he was trying to give her. "Remember how she lived, not just how she died." Buck positioned himself at the doorway, no longer the confused animal torn between loyalties, but a warrior, ready to defend his pack. His transformation was complete, from cattle dog to protector to soldier, in a war that had been 9 years in the making. The sound of approaching hoofbeats marked the beginning of the end. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether justice could still be found in a world that seemed to reward cruelty and violence. But for the first time since that terrible night 9 years ago, Silas felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. They were no longer victims running from their past. They were a family fighting for their future, united by bonds that violence couldn't break and love that death couldn't diminish. And sometimes, in a world where evil often seemed to triumph, that was enough to tip the balance toward justice. Sit down. War was about to begin, and they were ready to fight it together. The first shot shattered the desert stillness like thunder breaking across a clear sky. Silas couldn't tell who had fired, whether one of Varga's men had grown impatient or if a nervous finger had found a trigger at the wrong moment. But the sound galvanized everyone into action, transforming tense anticipation into explosive violence. Buck, move first, his ranch-trained instincts taking over as he bounded through the doorway with the focused intensity of a working dog protecting his herd. But this wasn't about cattle. This was about family. And the blue healer's loyalty ran deeper than training or instinct. He hit the ground running, his powerful legs carrying him in a wide arc that would bring him around behind Varga's position. Elena was moving almost as quickly, her rifle coming up with the smooth precision of someone who'd spent years practicing for this moment. Her first shot took one of the circling riders clean from his saddle, the man tumbling backward with a cry of surprise and pain. The accuracy was impressive, but Silas noted grimly that Elena showed no emotion at taking a human life. The child, who might have hesitated, was truly gone. Silas found himself falling back on training that was decades old, but apparently not forgotten. His father's Colt felt natural in his hand as he moved to a firing position that would give him clear sight lines while protecting Elena's flank. The muscle memory of a dozen battles came flooding back, how to read terrain for advantage, how to anticipate enemy movement, how to kill efficiently when killing became necessary. Varga himself had dismounted and taken cover behind a cluster of rocks, his scarred face showing more amusement than concern at the turn of events. The bandit leader was shouting orders to his men in rapid Spanish, coordinating their assault with the calm professionalism of someone who'd survived similar conflicts many times before. "The dog!" one of his men yelled, pointing at Buck's flanking maneuver. "Watch the dog!" But Buck was already among them, using the speed and agility that had made him legendary among cattle drivers to dart between the horses and create chaos in Varga's carefully ordered attack. The horses, already nervous from gunfire, began to rear and buck as Buck's presence triggered their flight instincts. 2 more riders found themselves on the ground, fighting to control their mounts while trying to keep track of their human enemies. Elena's second shot caught the man called Pablo as he tried to circle toward their escape route, spinning him around. and sending him stumbling behind cover with blood streaming from his shoulder. Her tactical awareness was remarkable. She wasn't just shooting at targets, she was systematically disrupting Varga's plan and forcing his men into reactive rather than aggressive positions. "Elena Rodriguez!" Varga's voice cut through the gunfire, carrying with it the same mocking confidence he'd shown earlier. "You fight well for a child, but this changes nothing. I still have more men than you have bullets." In response, Elena put a shot so close to Varga's position that rock fragments sprayed across his hiding place. The bandit leader's laughter suggested he was enjoying the challenge more than he was concerned about the danger. Silas took careful aim at a muzzle flash from behind a fallen log and squeezed the trigger. His shot was rewarded with a cry of pain and the sound of a rifle clattering against stone. The Colt's weight felt familiar in his hand now, like an old tool being used for its intended purpose after years of neglect. But it was Buck who was causing the most disruption to Varga's assault. The dog had learned from 9 years of protecting Elena that the best defense was often aggressive offense. He wasn't just creating chaos. He was actively hunting, using his speed and intelligence to isolate individual enemies and force them into vulnerable positions. One of Varga's men made the mistake of trying to line up a shot on Elena while Buck was in motion. The dog hit him from the side with the force of 40 pounds of muscle and determination, sending both the man and his rifle tumbling into the dust. The bandit's scream as Buck's teeth found flesh was audible even over the continuing gunfire. "That's enough!" Varga roared, rising from cover with a branding iron in his hands, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. The iron bore his mark, the same twisted design that had been burned into stolen cattle across the territory for years. "You want to know what happened to your families? I'll show you exactly what I did to them." The sight of the branding iron filled Silas with a cold rage that transcended rational thought. This wasn't just a tool for marking cattle. It was an instrument of torture, designed to inflict maximum pain while leaving the victim alive to suffer. The implications of Varga wielding it now, the promise of what he intended to do with it, triggered something primal and violent in Silas's chest. "You used that on Martha," Silas said, and it wasn't a question. "Among other things," Varga replied, his smile widening at the pain he could see in Silas's eyes. "She lasted longer than most, your pretty wife. Strong spirit, but everyone breaks. Eventually." The world seemed to narrow to a single point of focus, Diego Varga's scarred face and the branding iron he held like a trophy. 9 years of grief and guilt and helpless rage crystallized into one burning need: to end the man who had turned his wife's final moments into an exercise in prolonged agony. Silas stepped out from cover, his father's Colt steady in his hand. Around him, the gunfight continued, Elena's rifle barking responses to muzzle flashes from Varga's remaining men. Buck's continued assault on anyone who tried to close with their position. But all of that seemed distant now, less important than the reckoning that was finally at hand. "Your turn, Varga," Silas said quietly. "Let's see how you handle pain when it's coming for you instead of some helpless woman." Varga dropped the branding iron and reached for his own weapon, but his movement was a fraction too slow. Silas's first shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. The bandit leader stumbled but didn't fall, his scarred face twisting with rage and something that might have been respect. "Not bad for an old man," Varga gasped, pressing his hand against the spreading bloodstain on his shirt. "But you'll have to do better than that." The confrontation that had been 9 years in the making was finally underway, and both men knew that only one of them would walk away from this desert ruin. The question was whether justice or cruelty would prevail when all the shooting stopped. Elena's voice cut through the gunfire like a blade through silk, carrying with it 9 years of suppressed grief and carefully controlled rage. "Diego Varga, look at me!" The bandit leader turned toward her voice, his wounded shoulder causing him to favor his left side as he moved. What he saw in Elena's face must have given him pause. This was no longer the frightened child who had hidden in a root cellar while her family died. This was a young woman who had spent nearly half her life preparing for this moment, and her brown eyes held the cold certainty of someone who had already made peace with what needed to be done. "I remember you," Elena said, her rifle trained. On Varga's chest with steady hands. "I remember your laugh when my little brother Miguel screamed for our mama. I remember how you made my papa watch while you—" "Enough!" Varga snarled, clutching his wounded shoulder. "You were supposed to die with them. Your survival was an oversight I've regretted for 9 years. "No," Elena replied, and there was something almost serene in her voice now. "My survival was justice, waiting for its time." In her left hand, barely visible but somehow commanding attention, Elena held a small rosary. Worn wooden beads connected by a thin chain that had obviously seen years of handling. The crucifix at its center caught the afternoon light, and Silas realized this was another artifact from her destroyed home, another piece of her murdered family that she'd carried through 9 years of hardship. Buck had taken down another of Varga's men and was moving to position himself for a final assault on the bandit leader himself. The dog's tactical awareness was remarkable. He seemed to understand that this was the crucial moment, the climax toward which all their preparation had been building. "Elena," Silas said quietly, never taking his eyes off Varga, "remember what we talked about. Justice and revenge aren't the same thing." Elena's grip on the rosary tightened, and for a moment Silas could see the child she'd been warring with, the hardened survivor she'd become. "I know, but some debts can only be paid." "In blood," Varga laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the desert air. "Listen to the old man, Nina. He knows what it costs to kill someone in cold blood. Look at his hands. They're shaking because he remembers what he had to become during the war." It was true. Silas could feel the tremor in his gun hand, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. Every man he'd killed during those terrible years had left a mark on his soul, a darkness that had taken Martha's love and years of peace to heal. The thought of returning to that place, of becoming that person again, filled him with dread. But then he thought of Martha's final moments, of the branding iron Varga had used on her, and the tremor stilled. "Elena," Varga continued, sensing weakness. "He could exploit. You don't want to live with the memory of pulling that trigger. Give me the gun, and I'll make it quick for both of you. That's more mercy than your families received." Elena's response was to kiss the small crucifix and whisper something in Spanish. A prayer, perhaps, or a promise to the dead. When she looked up, her face had found its peace. "My mama taught me this prayer," she said, her voice steady as stone. "She said it would protect me from evil, that it would help me find my way when I was lost in darkness." Elena's finger moved to the trigger. "I've been lost for 9 years, but now I've found my way." The shot seemed to echo forever across the desert, followed by a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Varga stood for a moment, his scarred face showing surprise rather than pain, as if he couldn't quite believe that. His long career of violence had finally caught up with him. Then he crumpled to the desert floor, the branding iron falling from nerveless fingers to land in the dust beside him. Buck reached the fallen bandit first, sniffing carefully before looking back at Elena and Silas with what could only be described as satisfaction. The dog's long hunt was finally over, his family protected and his duty fulfilled. Elena stood motionless for several heartbeats, the rosary still clutched in her left hand, the rifle steady in her right. Then slowly, she lowered the weapon and walked toward Varga's still form. "It's over," she said simply, kneeling beside the man who had haunted her dreams for 9 years. "For all of us, it's finally over." Silas joined her, holstering his father's Colt with hands that were steady now. The weight of the old weapon felt different somehow, not like the burden it had been for so many years, but like a tool that had finally served its proper purpose. The remaining bandits, demoralized by their leader's death and harassed by Buck's continued attacks, were fleeing across the desert on foot. They would likely never trouble anyone again, Men like that rarely survived long without strong leadership to hold them together. What happens now? Eleanor asked, looking up at Silas with eyes that seemed older and somehow cleaner than they had. Before, now we bury the dead, Silas said gently. All of them. And then we decide what kind of life we want to build on the foundation of what we've finished here. Eleanor nodded, understanding the weight of his words. They had ended something terrible today, but ending evil was only the first step toward building good. The harder work, the work of healing and forgiveness and creating something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, was yet to come. But for the first time in 9 years, it felt possible. They had each other, they had Buck, and they had the rest of their lives to figure out how to use the peace they'd bought with blood and courage and love that refused to die, even in the face of unimaginable loss. 3 months later, the sound of hammer on leather echoed through the small workshop behind the house Silas had purchased on the outskirts of San Miguel. His hands, no longer shaking with the weight of old violence, worked the tooling with patient precision, creating something beautiful from simple materials. Beside him on the workbench lay the completed product of weeks of careful craftsmanship, a new collar for Buck, hand-tooled with intricate patterns and fitted with brass studs that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the open door. Elena sat across from him, helping with the final details, her own hands steady as she worked. The workshop had become their shared space, a place where they could create rather than destroy, where the skills they'd learned for survival could be turned toward building something good and lasting. He's going to be proud as a peacock, Elena said, examining the collar with obvious satisfaction. Though I still think you're spoiling him, Silas smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. A dog who saves your life twice deserves a little spoiling. Buck himself was lounging in the doorway, content to supervise their work while keeping one eye on the dusty street beyond. His recovery from the wounds sustained during the fight with Varga had been complete, though he bore new scars to add to his collection. The dog seemed to understand that the danger was past, that his long vigil was finally over, but old habits died hard, and he still insisted on positioning himself where he could watch for threats. The house they'd made their home was modest, but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen large enough for Elena to practice the cooking skills she was determined to master, and a front porch where they could sit in the evening and watch the desert paint itself in shades of gold and purple. It wasn't the grand ranch Silas had once shared with Martha, but it was theirs, bought with the reward money from Varga's capture and the sale of Silas's remaining cattle. Sheriff Martinez had been surprisingly understanding about the circumstances of Varga's death. The bandit leader's reign of terror had been a thorn in the sheriff's side for years, and the discovery of his stronghold had yielded evidence of crimes stretching back more than a decade. Elena and Silas had been officially thanked for their service to the community, though the sheriff had made it clear that such matters were best left to proper authorities in the future. Elena, Silas said, setting down his tools to look at her. Directly, I've been thinking about what comes next. What do you mean? Your education. You're smart as a whip, but you've missed years of formal schooling. Mrs. Patterson at the school has offered to work with you privately, help you catch up on what you've missed. Elena's face showed the wariness that still surfaced when she felt her independence was being questioned. I can read and write just fine. Papa taught me before. I know you can. But there's more to education than just reading and writing. Mathematics, history, literature, things that could open doors for you that survival skills alone never could. Silas chose his words carefully. I'm not saying you need saving or fixing, but you deserve the chance to choose what kind of life you want, and education gives you more choices. Elena considered this, absently stroking Buck's ears as she thought. What about you? What about this? She gestured around the workshop, indicating not just the physical space, but the life they'd built together. I'm not going anywhere, Silas assured her. This is home now, for all of us. But that doesn't mean we can't all grow and change and become more than we were. The truth was that Silas had been thinking about education for himself as well. The local bank had approached him about a position. His reputation for honesty and his experience with cattle were seen as valuable assets. It wouldn't be the outdoor life he'd always known, but it would provide stability and respectability, things that mattered when you were trying to build a future rather than just survive from day to day. "Buck," Eleanor said suddenly, "and the dogs." Ears perked up at his name. "What do you think? Ready for your fancy new collar?" Buck's tail began to wag, as if he understood that something good was about to happen. Silas carefully removed the old rope collar that Elena had fashioned years ago, revealing the even older leather collar underneath, the original one he'd made so long ago, cracked and worn, but still serviceable. "We should keep this one," Elena said, running her fingers over the aged leather, "as a reminder of where we've been." Silas nodded, understanding. The old collar would go into the wooden box where they kept their most precious memories. Martha's locket with its tiny photographs, the charred piece of wood from Elena's family home, the wanted poster that had started their final hunt for Varga. These artifacts of loss and struggle would serve as reminders of what they'd survived and overcome. The new collar slipped over Buck's head like it had been made for him, which of course it had. The brass studs gleamed against his blue-grey coat, and the leather was supple and comfortable. Buck seemed to understand the significance of the moment, sitting perfectly still while Silas adjusted the fit and secured the buckle. "There," Silas said, stepping back to admire their work. "A collar fit for the finest dog in New Mexico territory." Buck stood and shook himself, the brass fittings jingling softly. Then he moved to position himself between Eleanor and Silas, as he had done so many times before. But this time there was no tension in his posture, no watchfulness for danger. This was simply a dog enjoying the companionship of his human family. Elena reached into her pocket and withdrew something that made Silas smile. A letter from Mrs. Patterson, formally offering Elena a place in her advanced students program. "I've been thinking about what you said, about choices and opportunities, and I think Mama and Papa would want me to have every chance to make something good out of what I've learned." Eleanor looked down at the letter, then up at Silas. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "Buck comes with me to school, and I keep living here with you, and Sunday afternoons are for working in the shop, learning your leather craft." Elena's voice carried the determination that had kept her alive through 9 years of hardship. "This is my family now. Education is fine, but I won't give up what matters most for it." Silas felt his throat tighten with emotion. The idea that this remarkable young woman would choose to remain part of his life, would call him family, was more than he dared hope for when he'd first spotted Buck on that dusty street 3 months ago. "Agreed," he said simply, "though I think Mrs. Patterson might have some opinions about dogs in the classroom. Then Mrs. Patterson will learn that some things aren't negotiable." Elena's smile was bright enough to light up the workshop. "Buck and I come as a package deal. We always have." As if in response to his name, Buck moved closer to both of them, his new collar catching the light as he settled down with a contented sigh. The three of them, an aging cowboy, a remarkable young woman, and a dog who had spent 9 years keeping. Them all connected, had finally found their way home. Outside, the sun was setting over the New Mexico territory, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight they were simply a family, complete at last, and ready to face whatever the future might hold together. The sound of brass studs jingling softly as Buck shifted position provided a gentle counterpoint to their quiet conversation, a musical reminder that some bonds are strong enough to survive any amount of tragedy and time. In the end, love had proven more durable than evil, and hope had outlasted despair. It was, Silas thought as he looked at Elena and Buck, exactly what Martha would have wanted. Not just justice for her death, but life and love and laughter rising. From the ashes of loss. The past would always be part of them, but it would no longer define them. They were home.